here we go. Okay, so this talk is not really a talk so much as a rant followed by a suggestion, but I hope that the rant will be plausible and the suggestion will be something that folks might take on board. So the basic idea that I have for you is that when we're doing history of philosophy, we need to actually pay attention to what the people we're interpreting had to say. And one way to do that is to use digital tools to see what concepts and constructs are most common and most connected in the writings that they have to offer. Failing to advance my slides. All right, so we're going to do some math. One thing I should say right off the bat is that I think, at least from the titles of the talks that I've seen for the rest of the workshop, this one is kind of unusual. So I'm using digital humanities methods on philosophical corpora. And as far as I can tell, everybody else is using digital humanities methods on non-philosophical corpora or even other objects to address philosophical questions. And that's cool. I think we should do both. Here's an example of what not to do. This is Christine Swanton's book on Hume and Nietzsche. And in her book on Hume and Nietzsche, she talks about Nietzsche as someone who supports something called virtuous egoism, which is actually a phrase that he never uses, not even in his unpublished writings. And it turns out that she actually gets this phrase from Tara Smith, who is a libertarian Ayn Rand stan. And I think that this is a really irresponsible use of the history of philosophy, that we shouldn't do this kind of thing. If you're going to give an interpretation of Hume, you should be reading Hume and reflecting the things that Hume was actually concerned about. If you're going to be reading Nietzsche, then you should actually reflect the things that Nietzsche talked about. This is one of the most egregious examples I've seen in allegedly peer-reviewed philosophy, but it's not at all uncommon. So for instance, I've got a proposal. We should stop cherry picking stuff. And this is very common in Nietzsche studies, but also in Hume studies, also in Kant studies. And a way to stop cherry picking is to do some math. And fortunately, I've largely automated that for you, so you don't need to do it yourself. You just have to do a little bit of math. Let me give you an example. So if you go to the Nietzsche source, which is this incredible resource that has digitized all of Nietzsche's writings, including both the published work and the unpublished work, and even his letters and the letters that were written to him, you can search that in the original German. And that's slightly tricky because his spelling changes in 1885. But if you know what you're doing, you can figure out what things he's talking about when. And so, for instance, you might, if you've taken like one course that deals with Nietzsche, think that he's really interested in and concerned about resentment or ressentiment. In fact, in his writings, he only uses this word 21 times. Not that often, mostly in the genealogy, a little bit in Antichrist, a little bit in the Twilight of the Idols, a couple times in Ecce Homo. So you might think like, this is the emotion that he's most interested in. But actually, that's wrong. Because if you look for what he has to say about shame, there's 159 passages where he talks about shame. So we've got an order of magnitude difference here. And what's maybe a little bit surprising is that if you then go to Phil Papers, which is another amazing digital humanities resource, and look at what people have had to say about Nietzsche on these two topics, you'll find the opposite pattern. So for instance, if you look for what he's got to say about resentment, you'll find that there's 107 publications that are documented by Phil Papers. By contrast, if you look for what Nietzsche has to say about shame, 13. Right, so we've got an order of magnitude difference in the opposite direction here. And this to me suggests that we are just getting things wrong to a certain extent. We are not paying attention to what the philosopher in question has to say. You might think, okay, well, maybe he doesn't have anything interesting to say about shame, but at least that argument needs to be made. You might think, he's got something especially important to say about resentment, but that argument needs to be made. And at least in my view, what has happened in Nietzsche studies, and this is not unique to Nietzsche studies, is that the fact that he put resentment or ressentiment in italics made it a kind of like shiny little object, and people ended up writing about it. The worst example of this in Nietzsche studies is the notion of the sovereign individual, which shows up in the genealogy of morals. It's a phrase that he uses precisely once in both the published and unpublished writings. And there's over a dozen papers about the sovereign individual. To my mind, this reflects poorly on the secondary literature. This reflects poorly on philosophers' ability to direct their attention to the things that are actually central to the historical philosophers that they're attempting to interpret. And I think that if we use digital humanities methods, we can kind of keep ourselves honest in a way that we have not managed to do so yet. And as Frodo mentioned in my book, I try to do this to some extent. So let me give you just some examples of how this might work. I'm just going to talk about shame because I don't have a ton of time. But the same kind of stuff can be done with other concepts and also with other corpora if you're interested in the history of philosophy. So the outline for what comes next is that I'm going to first talk about methodology and show you kind of some of the stuff that you can do if you use the R statistical platform to analyze philosophical corpora. And then until I run out of time, I'll show you some of the close readings that I've done specifically with respect to shame and Nietzsche, but that I think are merely illustrative of the kind of work that can be done in general in the history of philosophy, not only in German, but also in English, any other language, if you have a nicely digitized corpus. So for instance, one thing that people in Nietzsche studies argue about is periodization. So people will say, like, there's early Nietzsche, middle Nietzsche, late Nietzsche. And one thing that you can do using the Quantata package in R is compare texts and calculate the distance between them. You can calculate Euclidean distance, cosine distance. I think there's 3 or 4 others that you can measure to see how similar these texts are to each other. So for instance, this is what you see when you calculate the Euclidean distance on normalized token frequency of all of Nietzsche's published and authorized works. So a couple of his things came out after he kind of lost it, but they were authorized before he lost it. And what you can see here, for instance, is that Daybreak, Human All Too Human, Gay Science are more similar to each other than they are to any of the other texts. You can also see that Beyond Good and Evil and Genealogy of Morals are more similar to each other than they are to the other texts. Likewise, you can see that Ecce Homo and Twilight of the Idols are more similar to each other than they are to any of the others, and these form a kind of cluster together. These are generally, I think in Nietzsche studies, regarded as the middle and mature works. So it's kind of nice to be able to see in a quantitative way that these also kind of hang together. You can also see, for instance, that the untimely meditations cluster with each other. So, uses and disadvantages of history for life. It's pretty similar to Schopenhauer's Educator. And Nietzsche contra Wagner, or sorry, the case of Wagner is like really weird because he's just obsessed with Wagner and he doesn't normally talk about Wagner and the other stuff. So I think that this is like one useful thing that you can do. And if you want to say like within someone's corpus, across their career, there are different themes that they engage in different periods. This sort of thing will give you evidence that actually, yeah, that is in fact a similarity that we can detect using just the language that's in the text. You can also do cool stuff like word clouds. These are word clouds that I generated based on the early works. And what you're seeing are the most distinctive, not the most common, but the most distinctive as compared to each of the other books that is in question, words from each of the books that is being analyzed. So for instance, this will not surprise you, Richard Wagner in Bayreuth, very distinctive word, Wagner, okay. David Strauss as Educator, very distinctive word, Strauss. Birth of Tragedy, very distinctive word, tragedy. So some of this is like not very impressive, but it is a way of also pulling out some of the other stuff that you might not have expected to be distinctive of a particular book. And you can do this by comparing books within either the corpus of an individual, or comparing articles by the same philosopher, or comparing articles by different philosophers over time, and see what is most distinctive of each of them. Here's another example. So it will not be surprising that Wagner is listed here. But for instance, in the Antichrist, it turns out that the priest and instincts are very distinctive. And in gay science, drives are very distinctive and thinking is very distinctive. So if you want to investigate what is especially interesting in a particular book, one thing you can do is use these methods and say like, okay, well, this doesn't tell me what Nietzsche has to say about Wagner. It doesn't tell me what he has to say about God or Christianity or whatever it might be. But it does tell me that if I'm interested in what he has to say about this topic, this is the book to look at. And there are other things you can do using digital methods to examine these kinds of things. So what you're seeing here is what's called a lexical dispersion plot. And the rows are the different books. So this is Birth of Tragedy, published in 1872, David Strauss, 1873. If you come down here, that's Antichrist, 1888, and so on. And the vertical lines represent instances of the stem that is indicated up at the top. So this is what Nietzsche has to say about shame. And he talks about shame primarily using three different stems, so Scham, Schmack, and Schand. I will admit that my German is not terrific, but as I understand it, these are all different ways of talking about shame, being ashamed, being put down, being an object of derision, and so on. And what you can see looking at this is that actually Nietzsche talks about shame in all of his works, and that he's particularly interested in it in several of them. So for instance, there's just a lot of stuff about shame in Zarathustra. There's a lot of stuff about shame in gay science. There's this accumulation of stuff about shame, specifically expressed by Shand in the Antichrist. And I was curious about that, so I went and looked at it, and those passages are all ones where he's either quoting or referring back to quotes of the Luther translation of the New Testament. In particular, a passage where Luther translates the New Testament saying that God has put to shame the wise, the rich, and the powerful. So this kind of analysis can give us, I think, some insights into like what someone is interested in, what they're talking about, where they're talking about it, and what they talk about it in context with. That doesn't tell us on its own what they think, right? So I don't want to, this is why I call it modest. I don't think that we can use this kind of digital analysis to just like generate an interpretation on its own. But I think that it points us in the direction of things that if we're interested in doing the close reading ourselves, we will benefit from. So it's a tool for close reading rather than something that replaces close reading. Trying to advance. Some other stuff that you can do if you're using this method is look at things like the sentence length of mean sentence length of different books. So you see that, you know, early on Nietzsche was writing with very long sentences. I mean, Richard Wagner and Bayreuth, average sentence length is 40 words. That's ridiculous, right? Whereas Zarathustra, the average sentence length is like almost what, 2 or 3. That's kind of interesting. That might that might influence your interpretation. You can also build custom dictionaries if there are particular concepts or constructs within a corpus that you're interested in. And this is what I did in the book that Frodo mentioned earlier. So I was especially interested in what Nietzsche had to say about emotions, virtues, values, stuff to do with moral psychology, the things you see here. And this is a sort of a screenshot of the custom dictionary that I built. These are not easy to make. So for instance, the dictionary for what in English is affect actually has 2 inputs, one spelled affect with a C and one spelled affect with a K. And that's because Nietzsche changed his spelling in 1885. He Germanized his spelling. So if you're looking at a historical corpus, you actually need to be like quite careful about this kind of thing, because you can't just assume that people spell things in the way that they now spell them. And that means that you can't necessarily operationalize concepts that you're interested in without that kind of awareness. But if you do this kind of thing, you can use it to examine like where various concepts crop up in different books. So for instance, if you want to know what Nietzsche has to say about shame, you probably should be looking at Thus Spake Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil and the Antichrist and Gay Science. You can probably get away with ignoring Birth of Tragedy and Uses and Disadvantages of History for Life, because they don't have much about shame, at least not explicitly. That's not to say that you can be sure that if these 3 word stems are absent, that the concept is not being discussed, but it's at least a good way to get started. And I think that this is a useful approach when you're dealing with a large corpus of, you know, a dozen books or so. You can also do cool stuff like this, where you look at the ego net of a construct that you're interested in. So what you're seeing here is an ego net for shame mapped against all of the other constructs that I was interested in and operationalized with the custom dictionary that I showed you a couple slides back. And the larger the edge between the node shame and any other node, the more likely it is that the words that express those constructs occur in the same paragraph. So that suggests, to me at least, that if you're going to give an interpretation of Nietzsche on shame, that you should think also about virtue and laughter and conscience, and contempt and disgust and curiosity and emotion, right? So this is what I have in mind by a sort of default constraint. Like, if your interpretation of Nietzsche on shame doesn't make reference to virtue and laughter and conscience, then you're probably wrong. You might not be wrong, but you at least owe an argument for why those things that he keeps talking about together are not actually conceptually connected in his thinking. And I can share the code for doing this in an automated way with anyone who's interested, and it's code that can easily be adapted to other corpora beyond the Nietzsche corpus. And to make that kind of thing, you need to do matrix multiplication. So there's my joke, and no one's laughing. So that's kind of the thing that I want to suggest and advocate for. I think I'm probably going to be out of time, so I'm not going to go through all of the close reading that this has suggested to me, but I do have a paper on Nietzsche on shame, and basically the argument is that he thinks that shame does 4 different things. One is that it helps to regulate game theoretic equilibria. So if someone kind of gets above themselves, they get put to shame, and that keeps them in their place, and that results in game theoretically, evolutionarily stable strategies. Another is that once people know that they're in a society where that kind of shame might be cast upon them, they develop a sense of shame, which he calls the pathos of distance. And that makes them sensitive to both what might put them to shame and also what might put others to shame. And they go out of their way to avoid both of those to the extent that they can. He also talks about vicious shame, which he conceives of as an emotion that is directed at a fixed or unchangeable aspect of oneself. And he thinks that this is really damaging and that we should avoid it. And the last is what I call in this paper counter shame, which he discusses in 2 different ways. One is counter shame, where you find people who are putting to shame other people who for things that are fixed about themselves. In particular, he thinks that Paul in the Gospels, sorry, not the Gospels, in the New Testament, does this kind of thing, putting people to shame for being human. And he thinks that Paul and those who follow him should be shamed for that. And the other is a kind of what I call uplifting shame, which involves not putting someone to shame for the fixed aspects of themselves, but rather for not living up to their own potential. And the idea is that if you shame someone in this way, you might motivate them to do better next time. So it's not down-putting shame, which is how we tend to think of it, but saying something like, you're better than this, you can do better than this. And I expect that you will next time. Thanks for your attention.